You can't hear me.
That's okay, just.
Okay. We're going to begin the interview, if that's okay with you, Mr. Brigette.
Yeah.
And again, my name is Deborah Davis, and I want to thank you for meeting with me to share your journey in your life. It's a fascinating journey. I'd like to begin by asking you, how did your family come to Lancaster?
Well, my family moved here from Maryland, somewhere in Maryland. And the Scots was my family.
I'm
And
sorry.
they had it all.
Okay, we're rolling again.
Okay, let's continue. You said your family moved to Lancaster from Maryland?
Yes.
Okay.
And I grew up in Lancaster. My mother was married to an Alexander Brigette.
Alexander Brigette.
Yeah, and he was a chef at Brunswick and different hotels and whatnot. I had several brothers and sisters, but I only knew one brother, and he and I grew up together. My mother's name was Louise, and she was a Scot.
Okay.
Her name was born in Scott. And they lived on South Queen Street. They had a hotel on South Queen Street in the first block of South Queen Street.
Did they own the hotel?
As far as I knew,
Okay.
there was a white hotel connected with it called the Fulton Hotel. And there was an alley between, and they're on South Queen Street. And they owned the hotel. It's called the Scott Hotel.
I see.
And my family grew up there. My mother was a Scot. And
What was your brother's name? Your brother? What was his name then?
Alexander is called Howard.
Howard.
Yeah, and he died in the Midwest somewhere, but he died when I was quite young, and
I see.
I was living with my aunt and uncle, and he had a different father than I did. His father was the bartender at Dale's home,
Oh, okay. Okay.
and I forget his name right now, but we grew up together, and he died during the war, and I served in Europe, and he served in the United States. And
How was it for you and your brother Howard growing up in the 7th Ward? Did you had neighbors? What school?
we lived on North Street, in many places on North Street, on Rockland Street and North Street
Yes.
and Green Street and all over the 7th Ward. We went to the Methodist Church.
The Methodist Church.
Yeah, AME Church. And we grew up in AME Church.
Okay.
And his father was the bartender at Elks Home.
I see.
And my father was different, and my father's name was Alexander.
Okay. What school did you go to when you were growing up as a
I
child?
grew up in the old Duke Street School. It used to be where
The old Duke Street School.
the old Duke Street School. And Mr. Myers was my principal. And when they closed the Duke Street School and he moved down to George Washington Elementary School, I moved down there with him, and I grew up there. I grew up in the elementary school there, and I went back and taught there eventually. I taught there at George Washington Elementary School.
The old Duke Street School, can you remember where that was located?
Oh, yeah. On the top of the hill, right across from the Mennonite church, from the,
Really?
yeah, it was the Methodist church then, and Lutheran church then.
Okay.
And it was on the corner there, iron. I went to school there,
Okay.
the old Duke Street School. And when that moved down to George Washington, and he went down as the principal, I went,
And
that
you
moved down
followed-
there
moved
too.
down there too as well.
And it became sort of a leftover, and it was still a playground and whatnot. But I went to kindergarten through first grade there,
At the
and
old
second
Duke
grade,
Street School, or-
sixth grade,
Okay.
and well, it was.
Did you have many neighborhood friends to play with as you were growing up as a child in the
Oh.
7th Ward?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I lived on North Street, starting at the top of the hill. And I moved different places on
On
North Street.
Okay.
And, of course, the Duke Street at that time was all Jewish, and almost all Jewish.
Okay.
And I worked for a long time at Bloom's drugstore. When it moved, it was on North Duke Street, and then it moved down to 2 blocks, the Duke and Locust, and it moved down to Chester Street and Duke Street. And I just grew up there in the 7th Ward. My mother died when I was 12, and I went to live with my aunt and uncle, Shorters, Martha Shorter,
Right.
and they lived across from the Mennonite church. Of course, there was no Mennonite church there when I moved down there, and there were 3 houses. My aunt and uncle lived in next door, Uncle George Shorter,
Okay.
and my Aunt Martha lived she raised me, and my mother died on Rockland Street. She walked me down this hill to her house,
Okay.
and I became part of her family. She had
understand she
no
was-
children.
Okay. She didn't have any children. so-
No, I was her only son then. I was 12 years old, and well, she became a mother,
That's nice.
and she raised me. I went to the Army and from her house.
Okay.
I served in Europe for a long time.
I want to talk about the Army, but before I do, I'd like to ask you, I understand your aunt was instrumental or helpful in you continuing your education.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, when my mother died when I was 12 years old, and my Aunt Martha Shorter raised me, and she was very good at me, keeping me on the books.
Okay.
And I eventually went to Franklin Marshall and to Millersville. I got my master's and whatnot. And she just saw me through the education.
So she insisted that you complete your education.
What?
She insisted that you complete your education.
Yeah,
Aunt.
yeah, she insisted that. And I got my master's from Millersville, went to F&M, Franklin Marshall, and I went to Millersville and got my master's. And I taught school for a long time. And an old school that I went to as a student, George Washington Elementary School. And I remember moving to George Washington as a student with Mr. Myers, whose wife was a guidance counselor at the time. I don't know whether you remember, you wouldn't remember
No.
that.
I don't.
But it was quite an experience. And my mother died when I was 12, and my Aunt Martha raised me.
How was high school for you before you went to college? What was your experience like at high school? Did you go to McCaskey?
I went to McCaskey. My mother died very young, and my Aunt Martha and John Shorter lived across from the Mennonite church. It was an empty field then, and we used to play baseball over there all the time.
Oh, okay.
And but at 9 o'clock, I had to come and sit on the front step. I couldn't play ball anymore. My aunt and uncle were kind of strict on that, and I could sit on this front porch, front step, and my aunt and uncle lived next door. My mother's aunt and uncle
I see.
lived next door, and his name was Shorter,
Okay.
and
So after McCaskey, did you go to college or did you join the armed services, like the Army, because that was
well,
very common back
I went to Millersville. I went to F&M first.
And that's right after McCaskey?
Yeah, I went to Franklin Marshall first, but I went to the Army, and I served in the Army first, and then I went to
To F&M?
F&M.
Okay. What was the Army like for you?
Well,
Where did you serve?
I was a clerk, a company clerk, and I had my basic in Missouri, and Babe Polite saw me on a list, a shipping list. I was on my way overseas, and he pulled me off of it, and he was my boss at a load camp between Pittsburgh and Erie.
Okay.
And I credit him with saving my life, because otherwise I was on my way to the Battle of the Bulge. And I always embarrassed him by saving my life. But
Well, that's something to be thankful for.
yeah, it was. And I miss him a lot. I mean, he became kind of looked after me during the service and whatnot. And
And how many years were you in the service?
on a minimum, about 2.5 years during the war. And
And did you serve abroad? Did you serve in France?
yes,
Or another?
I went back to France after as a civilian, and my family grew up in France.
Did you learn to speak French?
Oh yeah, I spoke French a lot, but I've forgotten a lot of it now. But
Really?
I imagine it would come back as I lived through it. And my family grew up in France. There's two of my family here, and they were only about this big when they lived in France.
That's amazing. How long did you live in France with your family?
Oh, several years.
7 years.
Several years. I don't know
That's
how
a
many.
long
of them.
time.
Yeah, and they went to French kindergartens, and
What an experience.
they eventually went to military school, because I was in France on a military base, and I was a civilian employee of the Air Force,
Right.
and so they had the advantage of going to both kindergarten and French schools, and also going to American schools,
Oh, that's nice.
so that they had the, sort of an advantage there.
What was their experience like? What was the experience like for your children being African American and living in France
Well,
and going to French schools?
We lived on the French economy. We lived in the French community.
Okay.
We didn't live on the military base. And they grew up in the French community, and I know we went back several times. We've been back, my daughter and I have been back a couple of times.
Were they able to make friends and have playmates?
Oh, yeah,
In
yeah.
France?
Yeah, they had French playmates. We lived in the French community, and they spoke French, and they had,
That's wonderful.
they would tickle me once when I would see them, my son and then my neighbor's son, speaking French and English together. And my oldest son would ride on the back of his tricycle, and he would try to get the French boy to run on the back, and he would have to say it in French, and then he'd say it in English, and then the guy would repeat it in English. And we lived in the French community. It was a
So you were
good
somewhat
experience.
integrated into the French community. You actually kind of engaged the French community.
Yes, we lived in the French community. We lived in an old Army officer's house in a place called Châteauroux,
Châteauroux.
and it was halfway between Orléans and the Spanish border. And we enjoyed living there, and we've been back. My daughter and I have been back several times to
How
to
nice.
Europe, and
Yes, good.
enjoyed it.
Let's talk a little bit about your experience at Franklin and Marshall College. How did you select Franklin and Marshall College?
Oh, my. It goes back a long
It
time.
does go back a long time.
Yeah, but there were three of us at Franklin Marshall at the time. Grant Means, Sumner Bohe, and I were the first three to attend Franklin Marshall on a regular basis. And Sumner Bohe, I think, was the first. And Bobby Means and I went to school after he was already there. Sumner Bohe was already, his mother was the first director of Christmas Attic Center,
Oh,
Sumner Bohe. And he was raised on Duke Street,
okay.
and the center was on Duke Street at one time. The Christmas Attic Center was on Duke Street, and they lived on the second and third floor. And the first floor was, before it then moved around the corner, the first floor was on Duke Street. And we went to the, played in games and whatnot on the first floor before they moved around the corner on Howard Avenue.
Okay.
So it was quite an experience.
I bet it was.
Now, my grandmother, who I was named after, her name was Sidney Scott.
Sidney Scott.
Yeah, and we lived on North Street, right behind the old first Jewish store on the corner, and in the first house on North Street. And she was named after me. I was named
Oh,
after
you were
her.
named after her.
Yeah,
Right.
I spelled mine with a Y, and she spelled hers with an I.
Oh,
But we became, we lived right in the first house, right off of Duke Street. The
Okay.
grocery store was on the corner, and we lived in the first house. And my grandmother was Scott, and I was named after her. My name is Sidney, and her name was Sydney, but she spelled hers with an I, and I spelled mine with a Y.
Can I ask you another question about Franklin and Marshall College? Because I'm curious. You attended Franklin and Marshall College at a time when there were very, very few minority students.
Yeah, there were no minority students when I was there.
None. And then
There was Grant Means, and I, and Sumner Bohe.
What was that experience like, being one of 3 African-American students during that time period?
Well, we lived at home. All 3 of us lived at home.
You stayed at home, lived at home?
Yeah, we lived in Lancaster, and I was raised by an aunt and uncle, shorter, on Christian Street.
Okay, so
Sumner
you continued
Bohe
to
was
live then. Gotcha.
married to, he was raised by his mother on Chester Street, and Grant Means and I was made. His father was the chef at the old hotel on Prince Street.
So you commuted back and forth from home to Franklin and Marshall College.
Yeah.
What kind of reception did you receive from the other students and from the faculty?
Well,
Were they accepting?
it was accepting, yes, and it was nothing that stood out for us as far as, I can't think of anything that was special about it.
Okay.
We lived at home. We didn't live on campus, the 3 of us. Eventually, there was students on campus, black students on campus,
Really?
but while we were there still,
Okay.
and they were from, one was from Harrisburg, and 2 were, I think one was from Chester and one was from Philadelphia. And Sumner Bohe and I and Grant Means were locals.
Right.
And we would always have to go to Philadelphia to belong to clubs or whatnot.
Social clubs, or when you say clubs, are we looking at social clubs to
Yeah,
dance and have a good time?
yeah. Well, of course, we had our own girlfriends that we could invite to
Okay.
campus on parties or whatnot, but it wasn't very often. And well, the 3 of us were exceptions, I think, in F&M. Sumner was the first, and he was an athlete, and he was a grade A, straight A student too. Grant Means and I followed him at F&M, and I think we were the first 3 that graduated from F&M.
That's wonderful.
And we would have to go to Philadelphia to join fraternities, whatnot. And I remember one time we were initiated in Philadelphia for a fraternity, and I was caught one time and pulled back, and I was ready to jump over in the river. But according to the person that pulled me back, I was headed for the wrong spot.
Oh,
But
my.
but
You were going to jump in the river.
but we were running. We were blindfolded.
This is
and
part of that, what they
we were
used to
running
call
along.
hazing?
Yeah.
Or, yeah,
At,
okay.
This was a long time ago,
Oh, my.
and because before there was any black students at F&M, we were local students, and the 3 of us, Grant Means, Sumner Bohe, and I, commuted. We didn't live on campus. The year after we started on campus, a year or so later, then they started moving students black
see.
students on
I
campus.
see.
But
So the three of you were trailblazers back
yeah,
then.
yeah, I think so.
I believe so.
Yeah.
So can you recall what you majored in at F&M, Franklin and Marshall College?
I was a history major,
Okay,
and eventually I taught history in public school.
right.
I taught at George Washington Elementary School. I also went there as a student, and I remember one time, the first day I was going there, I met a teacher that had been my teacher coming out, and she said, "Sydney, how are you?" And then when we talked a lot, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm going to be teaching here." She said, "Oh my God!"
I bet she was shocked and
Yeah,
surprised.
she wasn't surprised. She was surprised.
Pleasantly surprised.
But that was one of the first black teachers here at George Washington Elementary School.
What kind of impact do you think you made being one of the first black teachers at George Washington?
George Washington.
Yeah.
Well,
On the other students that were there.
I don't know whether I had any impact or not. I mean, I didn't feel any impact at all, but I had been there as a student. I had gone there as a student. And in fact, when the school was built, I was going to the old Duke Street School. And the principal at the old Duke Street School was transferred down there as the principal.
Oh my.
And his wife at the time was Mr. Myers. I don't know whether anybody here remembers him or not, but his wife was also a guidance counselor at Edward Hand. And well, it was quite I was at old Duke Street School, and I was transferred there to the George Washington Elementary School at the time when it became a full-time school, and the old Duke School,
Okay.
Duke Street School was closed. And at the time, the principal of the old Duke Street School was transferred as principal down there to George Washington, and I went down there as a student.
I suspect, I may be stretching, but I don't think I am. I suspect the fact that you are a graduate of the school, you return as a teacher at the school, that you became a role model without even realizing it.
I think so.
I think so,
Probably.
too.
And Buddy was one of my favorite students. He was teaching, I mean, he was going to Edward Hand when I was teaching at George Washington Elementary School.
Okay.
And I remember visiting his class one time when he was a student at Edward Hand. And we've been friends ever since.
That's nice. You went on to get your master's at Millersville State College.
Well, I went to F&M from a bachelor's.
Right.
I went to Millersville for a master's.
And how was that experience for you at Millersville? Because again, you went at a time when there were not that many minority, let alone African American students.
Well, as far as I know, at the time, there were only 2 or 3 black students at the graduate school at F&M. I mean, at Millersville.
Okay.
And
I believe you're correct.
that was quite a while ago. And so I can't think of anybody who's...
So you think your experience at Millersville was a good experience? As you were completing your master's?
Well, I got my master's at Millersville.
Right, right. Okay.
And I had no problem. I think I had one history. I was a history major, And I had one history teacher who was a go-getter, and he pushed, and wherever he found any crossing at Millersville, he pulled it down. In other words, any objection at the time when I went to Millersville, he was my go-between.
I see.
In other words, he didn't stand for any foolishness. In other words,
Did you encounter much foolishness?
what?
Did you encounter much foolishness at Millersville? You had someone who was an advocate for you.
No, at the time I was a history major, and the history major at Millersville was a doctor. I forget his name now, but he went to bat for me.
I see. Well, that was nice.
And at the time, I enrolled at Millersville for a master's degree. He had an effort to get me in at that time. And I don't know what the scoop was, but he had difficulty at the time pushing me in.
I see. I
But
see.
and I got my master's at Millersville.
That's great.
But
So you've accomplished quite a bit in your lifetime.
oh, I think so. But it never dawned
modest.
It never dawned on me that I was fighting at the time. But I understand there was quite an effort, and I had quite support from home. My Aunt Martha, although my Uncle John, he was all for me going in to work for him, and down at the, he worked at
Junkyard.
Yeah.
an antique, not an antique shop, but
Junkyard.
a what?
You worked at the junkyard.
Yeah, junkyard down on Prince Street, and he was all for putting me down there
I
and
thought
getting me
there
a
was some
job,
discussion as to whether you
getting
were-
me a job down there.
Right, right.
And my Aunt Martha insisted on I stay in school, and I stayed at F&M. So it was quite a fight there, but he wanted to put me to work right away.
Right.
And Aunt Martha said, as long as I stayed in school, I was going. She would work, and she worked for a long time.
That's amazing.
And so it was quite an effort, and I appreciate it.
Okay. It sounds like the education that you received from the schools in the 7th Ward was very valuable in helping you to succeed or to get started in life.
Well, I think the two people that were important were Mr. Myers. I don't know whether anybody remembers him or not, and his wife, who taught at Edward Hand, and he taught at the old Duke Street School. And he moved with me. I was with his movement when the old Duke Street School closed, and we moved down to George Washington Elementary School.
Right.
And he became the principal down there. And I was a student at that time. And he did a lot of pushing for me.
Okay.
And
Can I ask you a question? I'm going to change the direction a little bit. I'd like to ask you a question about politics. And growing up in the 7th Ward, did you have any exposure at all to politics, to what's the thinking, who's in office?
well, the first big push, I think, in politics came with Babe Polite.
With Babe Polite.
He was my scoutmaster when I was growing up. And he became active in politics long before I knew anything about it. But he was quite active, and I think he was one of the sources at the time, was quite active in the politics.
I know when you and I last spoke, and it's been a while, you mentioned the Communist Party.
The what?
The Communist Party. Was there any involvement
I had an uncle.
within your family? Yes.
I had an uncle, or cousin rather, Scott, who was involved with the original founding of the Communist Party here in Lancaster. And he was quite active in the Communist Party at the time. He eventually moved to New York City, and his name was Franklin Scott.
Franklin Scott.
And he was quite active, and he was instrumental in, once you moved to New York, he was instrumental in getting the party started. But
How receptive were the people in Lancaster towards the Communist Party at that time?
well, they weren't very accepting.
Okay.
He had a pretty hard time.
I was trying to find a way to phrase that.
They weren't very receptive. And he was quite active, and he eventually moved to New York City.
Yes.
But Frank Scott was his name, and he was quite active in New York at the time.
Okay.
So the Scott family, I was part of the Scott family. My mother was a Scott, and
I'm going to ask you, I'm going to shift gears again if you don't mind, and I'd like to ask you about the 7th Ward and some of the what you liked about it the most, what you liked about it the least. But are you feeling the need for a break at this time?
well, I grew up in the 7th Ward.
Okay.
I
Okay.
see you're not really hearing everything.
Right, right.
What's that?
Would you like to take a break to get some water?
Okay,
And we'll come back and finish the question.
okay.
Okay.
All right, and we're rolling again.
Okay. Mr. Brigette, can you share with me what your experience was like when you moved to France? Why did you move to France?
Well, I think there was more freedom in France. And I wanted my kids to experience that freedom.
How would you describe what type of freedom that you found? You said there's more freedom in France. But what type of freedom?
Well, they didn't have the South to contend with, for one thing. You were free to go any place in France you wanted to go.
Okay.
You didn't have to think about what you could do going any place in France, whereas you would have to think of doing when you went here in the United States. So we lived in France for a long time. I worked for the government for many years, and my kids grew up in France. They went to French kindergartens and
Right.
French schools, and
Right.
we were on a military base, so that when the time came for them to go to public school, they were able to go to a school in France, and on the base.
Right.
But we worked for Uncle Sam at the time.
So when you worked in France, you actually worked for the U.S. government.
What?
When you worked in France, you
Yeah.
returned to France and you worked. your work was with the U.S. Air Force?
Yes.
And what kind of work did you do for that?
Clerical
The
work.
clerical work.
I supervised what they called a warehouse that supplied
Okay,
the store, the country store, with products. In other words, PX.
is that like a commissary?
Yeah, commissary and PX and whatnot.
Okay,
So, and then I lived in the French community. I didn't live on a military base.
right.
My kids grew up in the French community, and they had French neighbors, French playmates and whatnot, and they went to French kindergartens. Now, when they were old enough to go to public school, they went to school on the base,
I see, okay.
but they still lived in the French community, so they spoke French. So this was important. And
What was your wife's experience like when?
my wife,
Yes,
my wife had experience, exceptional experience.
in France.
She was studied in France. She studied French in France. She studied music in France. She was experienced in France all over. And I used to tease her about there's some African students who lived in Paris who always enjoyed her.
Okay,
And I used to tease her about about it all the time. But there are a number of African students who lived in France who were from Africa. They never came to the United States. But they knew what she experienced in the United States wasn't the same as the freedom she had in Paris.
what did she experience here in the United States?
Why?
What did your wife experience here in
Well,
the United States?
Well, she lived in Mount Joy. She was a student from Mount Joy. And she lived under the most, what most of us lived under in the United States, the segregation.
Segregation.
And she didn't have that to worry about in France. And
There's that freedom you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
and she directed in music all over, not only the French but the American music. She had 2 or 3 choirs that she always
That's
supervised, and
She was really world-renowned in
Yeah,
terms of musician and vocalist.
yeah, she was a vocalist, and well, my kids grew up in France, and well, it was just an experience that was important.
Having lived in France and you returned to the United States, what was that like for you? That had to be a big transition for you and your
Well,
family.
What we could put up with in France, I think, did us a lot of good when we experienced the objections in the United States. I think it showed us that the world wasn't the same.
That there
all
was a
over.
difference. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
And well, I think we learned from that. And I think my kids grew up knowing that. And I think they're better for the experience.
I was going to say the difference was actually a very positive difference that they were able to see. That difference sounds like it was a very positive difference
Yeah,
that they were able to
I think so.
experience and see. Okay.
It was quite an experience for them. And we lived on the French community. We didn't live in a military base, and we took advantage of a military base
Right, right.
and school and whatnot. And but we lived in the French community,
Okay.
and
But now I'm going to bring you back to the United States, because we're talking about France. So now I'm going to bring you back to the United States.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you a couple more questions about the 7th Ward. And then we'll close our interview. What did you like least about the 7th Ward? And what did you like best about the 7th Ward?
well,
Let's start with least. What did you like least about the 7th Ward, living in the 7th Ward?
well, I like least the segregation where the black families were all converged in one area. That disturbed me. Once I experienced the living in France and living in Europe in general, where you were free to go anywhere you wanted to go, and you're free to do anything you wanted to do. Once I experienced that, I thought, well, it should be that way.
Everywhere, right?
Yeah. And it wasn't that way here. But gradually, it began to show here, gradually.
You saw changes in the
So
community.
it began to change.
Okay,
So that's an important,
that is important.
so,
What did you like best about the 7th Ward? When you lived in the 7th Ward, what did you like best about?
once I lived in the 7th Ward, I enjoyed it more once it expanded, when it's spread out.
Expanded in,
Yeah, and you went in different directions. You could go in different directions. The family wasn't restricted.
okay, physically?
Wasn't
could move.
you're free to go anywhere you want to
Okay,
go.
okay.
If you were bought a house in West End, you could buy a house in West
Okay,
End. But when it was restricted, when all the blacks lived in 7th Ward, then it was confining,
very, okay.
and you couldn't go where you wanted to go. Once it began to expand, then it became more like Europe, and you could cope with it.
As it expanded, do you think people were friendlier towards one another, more accepting towards one another? Do you think the whites were more accepting of minorities, African Americans,
I
and
think
vice
so.
versa?
I think so.
Okay.
I think my wife found that this also, she taught at the Catholic school for a long time.
Oh,
And this, I think, she experienced this kind of acceptance there that she didn't expect in the public schools, regular public schools.
okay.
And this was important to her.
I would imagine.
So
Very
it
good.
was quite an experience. Having lived in Europe and having lived in the United States, it was quite a difference. And we saw the difference as the United States began to change and became closer to what it was we experienced in Europe.
Okay.
And it was important,
For sure, for sure.
yeah.
Well, listen, I want to thank you for your time and your patience and sharing your journey. It's remarkable. And you truly have been and continue to be a role model for many of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. One more question.
One last question.
One last quick
Just
question.
the last.
What was your children's experience like when they returned from having lived in France and experiencing that school system and that community and moving back to the United States? What do you think how did your children experience the shift, the change
Well,
from France to the United States?
there's two of them right there. Ask them how they felt. How they felt the experience in France affected them.
Yes.
I think they can speak for themselves.
But we're interviewing you, though.
But we're interviewing you, and we want to hear it from your words.
Yeah,
Right.
as their dad, as
As
their
their
father.
father, as their father.
Well, I think it was more difficult for them to understand because they were so young when they lived in Europe that they were free to do anything they wanted to do. And when they came home, they found restrictions that they couldn't satisfy.
And how did they
And
react to that?
I think that had a bearing on what they experienced overseas, the openness that they experienced overseas, and acceptance was different. I think that was a good experience for them,
Right.
and they understood more what happened in the United States than what happened in Europe.
Yeah. What did they say to you? I know I'm taking you back many years, but what did they say to you that said, this is not the same as France. The United States is different. Because
When
you're daddy. We're gonna, things
Well,
aren't working as well as.
One thing that impressed me was when we were living in Europe, we had a French family. We lived in the French community. We didn't live on the military base.
Which is nice.
And we lived in the French community, and the French family across the street was a mixed family.
Mixed in.
Mixed, they were white and black.
Okay.
And the experience they found there, I think, as growing up, had an effect on them. For example, the boy across the street, the boy across the street was a mixed family.
Okay.
And that had an effect on them, I think, that they didn't realize at the time because they were just growing up themselves. And I think, I remember Jonathan one time was talking to a little French kid across the street, and he was telling him to get on the back of the bicycle, tricycle, and he was telling him in French to get on the back, the monte, monte, monte.
Right.
And, oh, monte, and then the guy got on the back. But this little things like that
Right.
that made a difference.
Do you think, with your children being exposed at a very early age to a mixed family, a racially mixed family, living across the street, made them more open to biracial, interracial, triracial families?
It
or-
probably did. I don't know. They can speak for themselves.
Okay, well, I'm talking to you now. I'm talking about you.
They can speak for themselves. But I think it had an effect on them, a positive effect on them, because they accepted the mixed family across the street.
Yes.
And then there was a mixed French family across the street that lived across the street from us. And the man was black and the woman was white. And they were a French couple. And there was no problem at all.
Yeah, right.
And I think that they were able to accept that without any trouble.
Okay.
And they were young then, and they also were very young. And of course, they didn't have to cope with what we grew up coping with.
Right.
And so it was different.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I
I
enjoyed,
promise you, I think that is the last question. Thank you so much, Mr. Brigette.
but not